Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my book corner, and we're talking about Akatar today, A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J.Mass. This first came out in 2015. Version I've got comes in at 419 pages long. Little bits of housekeeping before we get into the review. This falls under my banned books reads for the year. I will link the banning information in the description below. And just to give my thoughts on this, I can see why you wouldn't have this in a school library for under 16s or under 18s as it would be in the US. I have no issue with this being in a public library. There is nothing especially groundbreaking in here that you cannot find in a plethora of other books, be it the more spicy nature of some of the scenes or indeed the violence that's in here. Whilst it does have some gruesome moments and some spice, none of them feel gratuitous. So that's what I'm going to say towards that. The main reason I'm reading this, though, is I've had a few people sort of poke and prod at me to share my thoughts on this and to read this. A little bit of background. I have started reading Throne of Glass. I've read books 1 and 2, and I don't get the hype so far, and I'm not quite sure what it is. And a few people have said, no, they're the YA ones. Go read this. This is more adult. Now, I have seen this classed as YA, which I can understand, but I disagree with. But that's something to do with YA classifications. But is this the book that's going to finally sell me on Sarah J. Maas's work? The answer is no. Although I don't think this is bad. And to be more clear, I had a reasonably solid time with this. I enjoyed this more than Throne of Glass that I've read so far. So, with all that having been said, we will, as always, take a look at the story, the characters, the world building, and the presentation before I give a slightly more in-depth final thoughts at the end. So let's just begin. One of the criticisms I've seen of this is that the story reads a lot like a fanfiction rewrite of Beauty and the Beast. And whilst I can see why some people have come to that conclusion, I don't think it quite fits. It's close. There are a lot of similarities here, and you can clearly see the inspiration that's been pulled from. But there are enough differences here to make this a unique work rather than, in a sense, a retelling. So we begin the story with Feyre and their family. Her family are poor, starving. It's the winter time, and Feyre is the only one who can feed them because of her hunting skills. We will touch on that later as well because I have some issues there. While she's out hunting, she sees a doe being stalked by a giant wolf and decides that wolf might be a faerie, it might not. I shouldn't kill fairies, that's against the treaty, and then shoots it through the eye. Because that is a sensible choice to make when you know there's a cost for killing Fae. Not long afterwards, a hulking beast smashes down the door to their home and takes Feyre as punishment for her crimes. And she is taken to the Spring Court specifically within the Fae realm to live out her life. And this is where you have the situation of almost enemies to lovers in many regards. Feyre is concerned about their family, but they realise they can't escape, and they're in this alien world where everything is a threat. And they go from feeling begrudging hostility towards their captor, who is Tamlin, to a grudging respect and then a lustful need. And I emphasise the lustful need rather than love for a number of reasons. The story then progresses as she discovers information about a curse that's been bestowed upon not just this court, but courts throughout the Fae Kingdoms. I get information to do with that, and you start to unveil some bits of history for the Fae realm, which is called Pythia, I think, if memory serves. Was it Pythia? Yeah, I remembered something. Which, side point, looks incredibly like the UK. And then at the climax of the book, you have her sacrificing herself potentially to help lift the curse that Tamlin and his court in particular have endured for a significant period of time. The story does follow very familiar story beats from Beauty and the Beast and multiple other, especially Storytale-esque stories that have gone with the disadvantaged person being the only person who can lift the curse on the king. It is not an especially original trope, but it's one that does work as a good framework, and there is enough variation in here to differentiate it enough from retellings for it not to be a straight one-to-one. A lot of the discourse I have seen is that Sarah J. Maas is really good at character writing. Maybe she gets better. Out of this book, there are a total of 2 characters I find interesting. And the main character of Feyre I found really infuriating. Not in the same way as Selena from Throne of Glass, though. But we're going to come to Feyre last. I have a question for you, dear viewer, first of all, if you have read this book in particular, without spoilers for future books. Of the 3 male leads, which are in order of appearance Tamlin, Lucien, and Rysand, which of those characters is the most interesting to you after this book? Not the others, just specifically this book, because I do know some bits that happen further on. I'm just curious. But I'm going to start with the boys, and I'm going to start with the character that I think is the most interesting in many regards. Certainly the one who feels the most consistent and fleshed out for me personally, and that's Lucien. Lucien is very different to all the other male characters in this. For a start, he doesn't appear to have any romantic feelings towards Feyre. In fact, is initially at least positively almost hostile towards her, which I appreciate. Seeing her as a burden, which she most definitely is, and is shown to be multiple times, and an unnecessary distraction for his liege lord, for want of a better term. Lucien is very much the envoy of Tamlin's will, second in command in many regards to the Spring Court. Originally came from a different court, but something happened there, and we do dive into that with his backstory. And what's interesting about him is not only is he quite a snarky personality compared to everybody else in here, he isn't afraid to put Feyre in danger to further his own ends or his own motives, and fully accepts the growing relationship that the two of them have, and it feels like the most organic relationship within the entire book. He also has, in many regards, the most interesting backstory, as of this point anyway, as of this book, of all the characters that we meet. He's the only one, for example, who has some sort of obvious physical disfigurement beyond the fact of the masks that are stuck to them through the curses. And that highlights him straight off the bat, and as you find out bits about his history and his alleged cruelty, and then that gets peeled back, he probably has the most interesting character reveal within the entire book for me personally. Rysand, who is the last of the 3 males to get introduced, is interesting and slightly contradictory, and initially feels the most like a traditional depiction of the Fae. And I will talk about that in world building in a bit, because one of my biggest problems with this book is the way that the Fae realm and the people within it are portrayed. But very dark, very brooding, very threatening, and very manipulative. And he starts off as an incredibly interesting character, and I suspect he is further into the series as well. But then some things happen in the last act that sort of strip away some of that mystique that he has, which I didn't like as much. And finally, you have Tamlin. Oh, Tamlin. So Tamlin is a sad emo boy, basically. Or that's how I see him anyway. He's very much feels sad about everything that's gone on, sad about everything that's happened to his kingdom, sad about what's happened to family, and this grief is understandable. However, it comes across in a very pathetic form of way in many regards, and I don't understand what the clamouring is for this character. Yes, he's powerful at times, he is strong, he has a vicious and almost brutish side as well. But it just feels at odds with the other side of his character quite a lot for me personally. He also has issues with the idea of consent. There is one scene in particular on I think it's called the Fire Festival. Could have misremembered that though. After that, where faerie stupidity causes a situation to happen. And whilst I understand that the in-universe explanation for this, there are problems here. Well, that fetches us to Feyre. Feyre is a moron. First off, she's described as a hunter. And whilst certainly she has some prowess in hunting, I wouldn't say that she is actually a hunter. She's more of a trapper. And this actually does stay quite consistent throughout the story with her tendency to set up laws and traps to capture prey or fae or people, which I like that. That is good. That is consistent character work. But she makes boneheaded decisions consistently when she knows she shouldn't do anything else. Now, the bonus here is that unlike Selena in Throne of Glass, these are the rule and not the exception. So when she makes stupid decisions for plot reasons, that's fine because she's made stupid decisions all the way through. This very much feels like somebody who you say, don't press that red button, and then we'll go and press that red button straight away. The amount of time she is told to not do something because it could kill her, and she just gets saved by the skin of her teeth repeatedly, and then does the same thing again, is ludicrous to me. She is an imbecile. And the problem I have with this is she's meant to be the strong, independent, smart one. And whilst there is an argument of that independence butting up against sort of the restrictions that are being placed on her, there's a certain point where you have to sit down and go, you're just thick. And that's my thoughts on Feyre. I think she's not a particularly likeable character either. She's very prickly, which is not, again, in itself a bad thing. She is narcissistic. She's very self-absorbed as well. And again, you can explain some of this away, but there's a whole spate of negatives that sort of pile on top of her, which makes her feel really, really dislikable. Going to some of the side characters, the main ones to mention are her sisters, whose names I can't remember, and her dad. Her older sister is the more interesting one. I think, is it Nettie? Nesta? Something beginning with N. Who is very much the cruel sister in many regards. I find her more interesting because she's more flawed. The younger sister is just the dubious ray of sunshine. Feyre falls in the middle of the two. Her father is a complete waste of time because it only needs money and feels incredibly one-note and not particularly accurate. The other thing I want to mention with Feyre is the fact that she's illiterate. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but I am curious if her sisters can read, because she was 8 years old when her mother died. She was 9 years old when her father lost his fortune. If her siblings are literate, and I can't remember if they are or not, and she isn't, there is a question as to why that is a thing. So I'm curious about that. It does play into certain aspects of the story, especially one of the challenges towards the end. On top of that, it also explains some of her thinking, and this is juxtaposed with the fact that she loves painting. She is a very physically visual person, and this is important because I've seen a lot of criticism to do with a rhyme or a riddle at the end of the book, which a lot of people have just stood there and gone, why did she not get this? This is so obvious. And if you take a step back and think about the fact that she is so visual and not literate in many regards, it makes sense the way her brain thinks and the way she sees the world that she wouldn't get the riddle because of the mediums which she processes information. And speaking of the end of the book, we do have a protagonist here. I'm not going to say much here. I'm just going to say I thought they were a massive letdown. They felt too mustache-twistingly cartoonish villain for them to have any real impact for me personally. they were too far gone and too irredeemable. It felt like there was very few shades of grey there, and the ones that were put in were retroactively inserted to try and justify the character, and it didn't work for me. Finally, you have Alice, who was the maid to Feyre, and has some interesting bits of backstory and is an interesting character until they're used to be an exposition dump in the last quarter of the book to basically give Feyre all the answers to everything so she can move forward. And at that point, she stops becoming a character and just became a narrative device for me as well. So, a very, very mixed bag overall in characters. Whilst I've seen Maas praised for character work, the criticism I have seen about world building, and whilst I feel the character play that she does is over exaggerated in terms of its quality, I think not enough credit is given to this bit. My criticism would be that the actual physical descriptions of the world are often quite lacking, so it's a lot harder to visualize the scenes as they're happening. But there's enough lore building in here to pique your interest and make you want to peel it back a little bit more, and it makes you want more of the world. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing in many regards. It does lack detail, it's occasionally contradictory, but again, you can place that down to the fact that you're seeing this through the eyes of Feyre, who is in a foreign land in many regards, and therefore is fighting against her own preconceptions. But there's a lot here that I'm curious about. The treaty between the elves and the humans on the war is fascinating. The politics between the various courts is really interesting as well, and I'm really invested and interested in that. My other big criticism, though, is how human the Fae feel, because these are immortal creatures, and more often than not, the way they are described in most literature is at best amoral. Not necessarily evil, not necessarily good, because their concept of good and evil is so skewed by how long they live. Humans are basically just like cattle to them. And in many regards, Lucian is the one that best embodies that more traditional approach to humanity from a Fae point of view, which then softens over time. What I do like is some subversion of some of the basic Fae rules. So one of the big ones that it spoke about early on is the importance of ash, wood, and iron against Fae. And also, Fae can't tell a lie. And there's some interesting subversions of some of these tropes, a couple of which I actually really do like, and does add a really good, interesting depth to the story and level of manipulation to the Fae as a whole, and I really appreciated that. In terms of everything else, though, the world building is overall pretty solid. There are some really creepy scenes in here where you're meeting certain types of Fae, or the various different rituals at different times of years and so on and so forth, that are really, really strong. They're just lacking a little bit of detail. So in summary, I would say this is a world that I want to know a lot more about, and this book doesn't give me enough of that due to the fact it's focusing on characters that I don't really like. Presentation, and this is where I need to acknowledge the fact that this is a book that is not aimed at me as its primary audience, and I do have some issues with Maas's writing from a personal point of view. So I'm going to start off this bit by saying there is nothing wrong with the writing in this book, and the criticisms I have seen that this is fan fiction, I think, are unfair. This is better written than any fan fiction I have read, and there's enough original ideas or splicing of ideas together that do actually work and make sense, that make this better than a average fan fiction. And there's some things that I think Maas does incredibly well. The first thing, and it's my biggest criticism generally speaking in fantasy books, is to do with romance and sex scenes, and Maas does these quite well. They don't overstay their welcome. They are relevant to either the plot or the characters in some way. They are not overwritten. And whilst I have issues with some of the romance in here, none of it is badly written. None of it particularly overstays its welcome, although there are nodbacks to it further on. But again, they're in service to a story and a character arc, and that's fine. And the fact that none of it is gratuitous is an important thing, because fantasy has a bad habit of having gratuitous sex scenes historically that do absolutely nothing for anyone involved and just feel like they're put there for no especially good reason. The other thing that Maas does a really good job of is the action scenes, or just before the action scenes. You get a really kinetic feel as Maas is writing these points of the book, and it almost feels like cinematography in many regards. It clips along at a really good pace. It becomes more of a page turner at those points, and you obviously can't write an entire book like that because you, as a reader, would get exhausted. But there's a really, really deft hand at making sure that those scenes do punch above their weight. Especially as sometimes really there's not really that much threat there, but it feels like there's more threat there than there is, and it feels like an achievement when Feyre overcomes those threats. Added to that, you've got the sense of impending doom before some of these occasions. There's one quite early on in the book, and there is a good build-up of tension before the confrontation that occurs, and some solid foreshadowing as well. Where it stumbles for me is in the quieter moments between the scenes, between the more action-heavy points, where it feels quite laborious, where we're just dealing with Feyre and Feyre's thoughts, and nothing really is happening. There's some mild world building going on, or some very subtle shifts in character, but it's not engaging to read at that point. And a lot of that is due to the fact that I don't think Feyre is a particularly interesting character to read. I just think she's an idiot. So that is not going to help my perception of the style. And I will also say it's not as obvious here as it is in Throne of Glass, where I have a very similar feeling. But whereas Throne of Glass had some certain points in the character writing where it was, we need this to happen so character does this even though it doesn't fit, the way Feyre is written throughout is consistent. Consistently stupid, but consistent and makes sense. And also, this is pretty well plotted with some natural ups and downs in terms of rhythm and pacing of the story, and it flows overall pretty well with a kick up at the end of the book. So overall, the style isn't for me personally, but I can see why people do like it. Also, just a side point, there is a map in the books. That looks suspiciously like the UK and Ireland to me. Whether it's meant to be like that in a parallel world or not, I am not sure. I'm sure someone will let me know in the comments. But yeah, overall, it's reasonably well presented. It's just a writing style that I don't enjoy in the lax moments. I feel like I've come across as quite critical of this, and I do need to say now that whilst I have a whole host of issues with this book, I don't think this is a bad time. I had a reasonably good time with it, in fact, but a lot of that was in spite of itself. I find the world really interesting, but not well enough fleshed out for me personally. There's only a couple of characters that I really found especially interesting, intriguing, or engaging. I felt that the main antagonist at the end was a bit of a letdown. Feyre, I do not like as a character, neither do I particularly like Tamlin as the love interest, but both of them are at least written consistently here, and that is the key thing, and I enjoyed this more than I've enjoyed what I've read of Throne of Glass so far. So all that being said, I think this is a solid book to read. It's almost like what I'd describe as a popcorn book. It's a good time as long as you turn your brain off a little bit. I gave this 3.5 stars out of 5, which rounds to 4 over on Goodreads. We'll see if I follow on with this series later on. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. I'll catch you all soon.